Today we're going to look more closely at poem number 66, also known by the first line, "This is my letter to the world," composed in 1862. Together with poem number 154, "A Word Drop Careless," "This is my letter to the world" is an example of metafiction or metapoetry. That is, it is literature that is consciously self-referential and highlights rather than conceals the work as a creative piece of art. It is poetry that is aware of itself as a poem, how it is constructed, and why it is being composed. Emily Dickinson explores the role of poetry, or the art of poetry, in her works. Poetry is often an expression of intense personal and intimate urges. Dickinson's outpouring of more than 1,700 poems demonstrates her need to express her private observations, reflections, aspirations, passions, and fears. A reclusive individual, Dickinson dwells on personal introspection. As many critics state, it is solitude and life of self-denial that allows or perhaps dictates her need to probe the inner depths of life. "This is my letter" is placed at the beginning of her fascicles, bundles of her poems, and therefore is considered the introductory poem to Dickinson's suite and outlines many of the key themes or concepts which are prevalent throughout her poetry. This poem acts as a representation of the rest of her poems, and the letter or epistolary form a metaphor for her method of communication. The persona in the poem has written a letter containing a message that was inspired by the tender majesty of nature. This message will be delivered to future hands that the persona will never know. The poem ends with a desperate plea or imploring for the letter to be judged tenderly. The poem expresses the persona's desire to communicate. "This is my letter" is a reference to the act of correspondence. Poem number 66 is often regarded as a complaint about being neglected. Its letter or form gives an initial impression of the persona of detachment and isolation Dickinson establishes as she feels the need to contact the world. In her essay, "Longing and Belonging, Emily Dickinson's Poetics of Distance," Dr. Elizabeth McMahon states, "In Dickinson's poetry, the defining paradox of belonging and estrangement is mapped spatially across a sliding scale of proximity and distance. The desire for contact is most often thwarted by an unbridgeable expanse, or it is poised at the moment of possible connection." And so Emily Dickinson opens poem number 66. The first line conjures a vast expanse by the relation of a single missive, letter, being sent out into the immensity, the world. In her initial declarative statement, "This is my letter to the world," this is the most significant word in the poem, as it expresses the notion of belonging to language or her poem itself. The personal pronoun my establishes intimacy and personalises the poem from the outset. As previously stated, the core conceit of the poem is that of the letter. It establishes distance. A metaphor for the communication, it is a symbol of the persona reaching out, showing a desire for acceptance or seeking or communicating something. My letter also shows an awareness of her role as a poet, linking to metapoetry, a desire to pass on a message to the world. It attempts to create community in belonging. It signifies an individual experience and an attempt to contact with the world around them, or connect with the world around them. Yet, the juxtaposition of personal pronoun my and the word world shows a difference and the isolation of the persona. There is an opposition between the individual and the community. The second line, as Dr. Elizabeth McMahon notes, performs a reversal of the centrifugal expansion so that the immensity becomes a measure of the speaker's solitude, keenly aware of the space between this and that. This is a unilateral communication. It is one-sided, involving one person. This is not a relationship or communication that is reciprocal. The absolute negative never establishes distance and highlights the extent of the persona's isolation and separateness from the world. It is passive and dismissive. Many argue that while it clearly explores a physical isolation, it may also highlight Dickinson's literary isolation as a female writer. The poem, then, is a criticism of society that will not include or hear the voice of a woman. That never wrote to me. Sweet countrymen. There are many articles that you can find to read more about this gender reading of the poem. Whatever the reading, the line shows a natural feeling of indignant hurt as the persona expresses a need for acceptance or acknowledgement. Even though she voluntarily withdraws from society, she feels angry that it seems to function without noticing her. Her accusatory claim indicates that she begrudges or resents her invisibility. Lines 3 and 4 return to the larger matter at hand, the simple news that nature told. Dickinson reveals the message or content of her metaphorical letter. Simple is an understatement, as the actual message she is passing on is one of grandeur, mystery, and the beauty of nature, linking to the romantic aspect of her poetry. Line 4 uses the lexicon of emotion, tenderness, in opposition to the sense of alienation established in the first two lines of the poem. The word majesty having connotations of reverence, kingdom. The juxtaposition between the two words reveals her affinity. Contrastingly, these lines depict the connection of the persona to nature, shown through personification, nature told, emphasising closeness. Dickinson portrays exclusion as the catalyst for a transcendental relationship. A significant aspect of Dickinson's personal belonging is a detachment from society. It is only through that isolation that she can reach true fulfilment. Here she restores the balance between humanity and nature. Nature, like God, is an intangible force. The first two lines of the second stanza are ambiguous. The persona reveals that nature is part of a world that did not write to her, as nature sent the simple news to others, hands that she did not see. An allusion to isolation in the words, I cannot see. To hands I cannot see could also be interpreted as a statement of the way the persona is trusting her work to posterity. The synecdoche refers directly to a modern audience, in effect creating a new recipient of the epistle. This is reinforced through the word committed. She has no control over its reception and pleads, in the final line, in the name of nature for kind treatment. The persona recognises a larger power or culture in countrymen as she seeks something from them, for them to judge her tenderly. Countrymen symbolic of fellow humans, a community or nation. The contrast of her to countrymen, reinforced by the use of the caesura, shows her separation and detachment and highlights the universality of nature's bond and the power of creativity that is at the forefront of her perspective. Again, if we consider these gendered terms, it could be interpreted as representing Dickinson's isolation or detachment from male voices in the patriarchal society in which she was writing. The poem presents a paradox, a dialectic, that is evident in so many of Dickinson's poems. In exploring the opposite, for example alienation and rejection, Dickinson comes to a greater understanding of belonging, recognising the universal bond of nature that transcends the social constructs that seem to reject the persona. The concluding line of the poem is a desperate plea or imploring not to judge her too harshly. Dickinson explores a conflict between imagination and consciousness that the world might not support. Letter, never wrote to me, judge tenderly of me. Yet the last line expresses a hope that future readers will, out of love for nature, judge her tenderly. The speaker presents herself communicating nature's words. She uses the authority of nature to win the approval of unknown readers. Here, Dickinson provides a contrast between human society, complicated, complex, and judgmental, and nature, which is more simplified, tender, yet majestic. For Dickinson, nature can be a benevolent force. The poem oscillates between distance and connection, nature. While there is an attempt for interconnectedness, the poem ends with a movement to the self shown through the final word of me. In this poem, Dickinson uses rhyme to connect words or associations. Me, see, me. The criss-cross rhyming technique establishes a connection between ideas, mainly that of the self, of the persona, and a future generation or poetic pantheon she desires to belong to.